what I will try and do tonight is talk about my own journey here at Hubbard Brook and what I think it means going forward, and talk a little bit about some of the work I'm doing at EDF and how I think it relates back to Hubbard Brook and what it tells us about the challenges we have here at Hubbard Brook. And I have to start with this picture of Herb up on the left in an earlier day, and a picture of, I don't know if Lynn's here, of where I lived at Vassar College, because I met Herb Borman 40 years ago, a little over 40 years ago, when he came to give a lecture at Vassar when I was an undergraduate. And what's amazing is I remember that lecture, and I remember how I thought it was not very interesting. But I remember it. He talked about forest roads and the impact that forest roads had on the health of the forest. Well, despite the fact that I didn't remember it being very interesting, I remember the talk. I didn't know at that time I'd end up working with Herb, but I think there's a theme here that I want to raise, which is that Herb, at least the Herb that I knew, and Chris, if she's here, and certainly Becky and Gary and others, always cared about making an impact. And the theme, I think, of Hubbard Brook in the past is having an impact. Whether it was starting in the Watershed 2 experiment that Gene and Herb and Bob and others started, it had an impact on the national conversation about clear-cutting and forest practices. It was good biology, but it was also incredibly important to a national conversation about an issue that was incredibly important in that period in the 1960s, 50 years ago. And that experiment did those two things. And I think the hallmark of Hubbard Brook has been able to do those two things. Do good research that also has an impact on the national conversation. And Watershed 2 was a heck of a good way to start it out by, I think, a group of people who really cared about the world and cared about doing good science. This is just Watershed 2. I wasn't around then. I was in school then. And these were some of the early investigators in the 1960s. Regrettably, no, understandably, many of the people in this picture are no longer with us. It was a small group, though a diverse group of scientists. And I'll come back to that as how Hubbard Brook has changed. They published in high-profile journals. Here's an article by Gene and Herb, Bob and Bill Reiners about that Watershed 2 experiment. They did it in good scientific journals, but they went beyond. And the driving focus of that, I think, comes from this cartoon that Sidney Harris published 40 years ago that I really like, because I think it does sum up a lot, right? For those you can see it, the experiment's in the middle. It says, then a miracle occurs, and the one says to the other, I think we need to be more specific here in step 2. I think that is the challenge we face. We too often assume we understand how it all works. We're not willing to open it up, look deeply in, but at the same time, making sure we understand how the broader equation works. So that is the challenge that I think has been here at Hubbard Brook. And acid rain, identifying it here is an important development, an important accomplishment, bringing it out in the science. But it was more than that. And my time here at Hubbard Brook started with a trip first as a student at Yale, then about a year after that talk, when I first met Herb, staying at Pleasant View Farm. This is the modern renovated version. The sign comes back from the old days. The Pleasant View I stayed in didn't look nearly as nice as that. Those of us who stayed up in the rustics particularly, those who've been around. But it was about community. And what has been key here is allowing ideas to flourish, challenge, develop the good science, and keeping an eye on those larger issues of which we need to figure out answers and be relevant to real-world problems in real-world time. This was labeled, I pulled this slide out, it's from 1980. I'm a little darker and thinner in the back there. And it's the label in my slide collection was the critters. And this was the group of people who lived at that point in time in Pleasant View Farm. They were from Cornell and Yale and assorted other places, some now longtime spouses of some of the people in the room that were in there. But what was amazing about Pleasant View, and I think still amazing about Hubbard Brook, is the fact that out of that group of critters came some experiments. Experiments we would have never done otherwise. I'm not known as somebody who studies animals, but that's a cardboard for studying snails. We started a project over those beers and that dining room table that involved 4 of us who all did different types of science, but we realized there was a common issue about if we could understand the snail dynamics, we might be able to understand land use history, which I worked on, biogeochemistry, which we all worked on to some degree, and deer populations, which were then crashing in this area, Dan Pletcher. So it was Dave Strayer, Dan Pletcher, Stephen Nodvin, and myself who did this research on the side because we all lived in one house. We all had to cope with the vagaries of Pleasant View Farm. So innovation has been a hallmark of what's been going on here at Hubbard Brook, and it led to a lot of studies like this. We picked this up. Herb mentioned to me when I moved back east from Kansas to Brown University in 1994, Herb said, "You did that snail study. You better go back and do some more." And he was right. So I had some of my undergraduates work on it, and we've since worked on Watershed 1 related to that. Innovation took many forms. Ian, don't look at this slide. That's me with a chainsaw in a soil pit, innovating on how to measure soils. And that's not a fake photo. That chainsaw was going when that photograph was taken. That isn't the way we do it anymore, but it did allow development of some new techniques. Notice I did have a hard hat on. I wasn't totally stupid. And it was doing more with less. So that chainsaw came from Dartmouth College. Sorry, Dick. But Herb took it to Yale with him. It was 20 years old by the time I got a hold of it. And it didn't look very good after I'd finished with it in the soil pits. But we developed a whole large series of studies. Art Johnson joined. Sorry, it's a little grainy. It didn't blow up very well. Art Johnson from the University of Pennsylvania. We took that same technique, brought it up here into the watersheds. And Art, we worked on the first really large-scale quantitative soil effort here at Hubbard Brook in the early 1980s. Innovation, asking key questions. In this case, it was a whole tree harvest on Watershed 5. And what were the impacts of whole tree harvesting? Watershed there and Watershed 5. That issue is alive today in even more so than it was in 1985. And I will, in this case, say I'm not sure Hubbard Brook has risen to the occasion on this one. We have not brought that data to bear to the conversation that's going on right now in Washington about the impacts of whole tree harvesting biomass, burning of biomass. Here's a biomass plant that's being debated right now. Yet we have some of the richest data sets, but we have not brought it to this conversation. The challenge for the future is ensuring that we don't ask the same questions of the past, but we have as much relevance as the project had in the past, whether it was forest management or acid rain. In this case, we've set up the experiments. They're 30 years old. They are incredibly relevant, and yet we're debating in policy circles some of the science that we set out 30 years ago to try and understand. Picture of the crew again, Hubbard Brook at the cooperators meeting tomorrow. Notice it's getting a bigger organization. I will note, here I am again, a lot younger, a lot darker, a lot more hair. Hubbard Brook grew. There have been more people. I heard today that the estimate is we're going to have an all-time high tomorrow in the cooperators meeting of 180 people. So top is the first. That's already not the first year. I'm guessing, Gene, you would know better, maybe 5 years in or something, 68, because I actually don't know what year that photo was. It was growing. You see a lot of the students that were here. It was a dynamic and growing community of scientists who were learning and exploring about innovation and how to bring that to bear. There was a lot of teaching going on. It was just a picture. I don't know if Chris joined us, but for Becky, this was Herb's 60th birthday with his graduate students at the time. There was a lot of teaching going on here at Hubbard Brook. Transition to long-term. Hubbard Brook still relative to some places, still pretty young. This is a picture of Rothamsted. This experiment was set up in 1843. And so they're now 172 years in. We're 52 or 60 for the site. But I love this because this is a really great institution. It almost failed. Laws and Gilbert started Rothamsted, the longest continuous experiments in the world that I'm aware of. It's Agricultural Experiment Station. They are the developers of super triple phosphate. And in the mid-20th century, this kind of classic experimentation became passé. Nobody at Rothamsted cared a whole lot about this. It survived because the founders had the wisdom. They also had the money. They developed super triple phosphate. This was the baronial estate of laws to put a stipulation in turning this over to the British government that these experiments must be continued in perpetuity as part of the turning it over. So they did do what was required. They'd squandered the endowment by that time. They kept it going. It's relevant, and why did I show up there? The sort of fun thing was because this is a picture of a wilderness. This is the Broad Block Wilderness right here. That's it. This is the Broad Block Continuous Wheat Experiment. And I'd read about the wilderness. I didn't quite understand what it meant. I don't know if you can read it, but that sign says Broad Block Wilderness after continuous wheat, 1843 to 1882. So when I took this photograph, they were 100 years into the post-50-year experiment. It's a lot of edge, but it's an example of what we need to aspire to. How can we keep Hubbard Brook on the rich tradition alive into the future and relevant? Some of the experiments, the more recent, the Wollastonite application to watershed 1 is a powerful example of how that's been done. The sandbox experiment, here's Herb coming out of that carrying a red pine tree that used to be down there. Gene was just asking me about it, whether it's going anymore. It's not. It was a fun experiment to get started. This is a more recent picture of the community. So think that first group, think of this, and tomorrow there'll be 180 people. So it's about adaptation, change, growth. Hubbard Brook of the future, the only thing I can predict is it won't look like the Hubbard Brook of the past. It won't look like the Hubbard Brook that I thought was such a well-established experiment and site when I arrived here, and it was 13 years old when I started as a graduate student, and I felt like I was just late to the game. It had all already happened. But one of the things that has happened is change. And we need to think about the Hubbard Brook of the future in the context of that change. This is a picture from Waterville, which is just over in Waterville Valley, we call it now, 1903, of what's called a spruce old growth. It was a spruce slope. It's a forest that, for all intents and purposes, looked like the watersheds. We don't have photographs from the watershed. It looked different than today. Same elevation as the watersheds. And this is a land use map that we've created for Hubbard Brook area. So this is not quite all of Grafton County, but it's the area. So Hubbard Brook is located right here. This is the Hubbard Brook Valley. So this is Thornton, Woodstock, and Ellsworth. So it's actually a little more over here. And what you see is all these colors is the land use that was ongoing in 1860. Hubbard Brook is an island in a sea of land use. That's an opportunity to exploit. There's been lots and lots of change on this landscape where we come. We shouldn't think of it as representative necessarily, but it's of change, dynamic change. This system has been changing. It will continue to change, and it's a wonderful opportunity to understand that change. The example is just the forest. On the left is the composition of the forest at the time of settlement, 1700 to 1800, and the importance of the size of the proportion of this full 360 circle is the relative importance of red spruce versus the same way today. And here we are in Grafton County, roughly over here. Spruce is relatively unimportant, and in the past it was very important, including here in the valley. It's about change, and it's about preparing and exploiting that change to understand the future environments and the ways that Hubbard Brook can cheat. I love this slide that Matt Vedabunker took in one of the plots we were working on. For those of you who are forests, you know that's a spruce tree. and the seedling at its feet is a northern red oak. That is, I think, a good metaphor for what's happening. The forest of the past is not the forest of the future. The Hubbard Brook of the past is not the Hubbard Brook of the future. We need to recognize that change and learn how to exploit it. To think about how can we ensure that the legacy that Gene and Herb and others have left us here at Hubbard Brook is going to be as vibrant in the future as it was in the past. To do that, we need to think about our science in different ways, different models, doing science in a different way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've done recently and what I'm doing now as an illustration of what I think the future could look like. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I do know is that unless we push hard to think out of the box and to use science in different ways, we won't be as relevant as we could be and need to be. So some of you know that 10 years ago I was asked to go and be part of a meeting on the top of Mount Washington to talk about Hubbard Brook science with a CEO of a major corporation. The fun story was that I got invited while sitting on Block Island on a vacation in which I was supposed to be unconnected to anyone. But I found an email. I have a good friend, Michael Oppenheimer, who was then at the Environmental Defense Fund as the chief scientist. He's now at Princeton and has been there for a long time. I was visiting Michael. He said, "You got an email?" I said, "How could I have an email? Nobody knows I'm here." And anyway, Will Abbott, who has participated in the Hubbard Brook community, and I had been talking a few days before I left. Somebody talked to Will Abbott about going up to top Mount Washington. He said where I was, long and the short. They asked me if I would come and talk about the impacts of climate change on the White Mountains to a CEO who is going to be at the top of Mount Washington for the day. I said, if you can track me down on Block Island, I'll go. So which I did. The CEO was Lee Scott, the CEO of Walmart. He was interested in trying to figure out what was about climate change, though he quickly said, let's not talk about the science. I accept you know more science than I do. What I want to know is how's the science relevant to my customers and to my company. Hubbard Brook was the launching pad. The reason I was there is because I understood the impact, or at least had studied the impacts of climate change on Hubbard Brook and the vicinity. It gave me an opportunity to talk to Lee. I was a professor at Brown at the time, and I didn't talk to him about the research was here. We quickly devolved to what his company could do. In that case, I said, the biggest thing you can do is sell efficient light bulbs to all your customers. What I didn't know when I said that was that they sold 1/4 of all the light bulbs in America. Lee accepted that challenge. My students developed the models to figure out how many light bulbs they should sell. Lee set that target based on my recommendation to my students. And the beginning of 2007, this was the headline in the New York Times. They did sell all the light bulbs we asked them to sell, and they did start what was later that year was a law that banned incandescent light bulbs in the current form. The point was Hubbard Brook was the base on which I could do that work. I didn't go to Mount Washington expecting to do that, but I did go there armed with what I'd learned about systems work here and how to do it. What I want to do is spend the rest of the time going through quickly some work we've been doing on natural gas that I believe comes directly out of Hubbard Brook and out of what I learned how to do here in systems and how to make that science relevant using very different models of how to do science. And I think that we at Hubbard Brook need to think about how can we create those new types of models of doing science, not the traditional way, different partnerships, new partnerships, and on different timelines. Because to be relevant and policy impactful, I think we have to do science quicker while we're still doing our base work, and we have to do it with more effective partnerships. So this is a paper that was in Science that Shoemaker et al., a group out of Harvard, published, just trying to understand the difference of the impact of different climate change gases, short-lived forcers and long-lived forcers, on the climate. And they modeled a sort of a conservative, it's not a business as usual, but conservative scenario over the next 200 years, what would temperature change look like? And if you add a mitigation for short-lived forcers, what is a short-lived forcer? What's a short-lived, what we call a short-lived climate pollutant? It's methane, black carbon, HFCs. And what happens, the reason is they break down in the atmosphere. They're very powerful, in affecting the climate, but they don't last nearly as long as things like CO2. So if you control them, you're going to slow the rate of climate change over the next 40, 50 years, and then you won't have much impact. So that's good, but not sufficient. If you just do CO2, you won't have a whole lot of effect on the climate in the short term, but you'll have a big impact in the long term. And what you need to do is both of them, and when you do that, you actually get the maximum amount of climate benefit. This is something that most people hadn't really focused on, the importance of doing two things for climate. You need to affect the rate of climate change and the magnitude. To do that, we need to mitigate CO2 and short-lived climate pollutants, which are dominated by methane. Currently, the climate change we experience right now, that we're seeing at Hubbard Brook and elsewhere, 1/4 of that comes from methane in the atmosphere. So the impact is large, and it's real, and it will determine how much we see over the next 30 to 40 years. It's the climate change I'll experience and my daughter will experience. CO2 impacts will be the climate change that my daughter's grandchildren's grandchildren will experience in the future. I don't think there's a trade-off. The ethics are, do I worry about now or the future? We got to worry about both. To do that, we need to think about how to reduce methane emissions. I got to that answer, to that thought, using the kind of science I'd learned here at Hubbard Brook. A systems approach to a basic problem, taking basic biogeochemistry. And then we needed to come up with the metrics to deal with this. This was a paper we published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, a few years ago, 3 years ago, to try and develop a metric that allowed us to understand the implications of fuel switching and how much methane leaking from natural gas is largely methane, would offset the climate advantage of going from coal to natural gas, from gasoline to natural gas or diesel. And I can later explain how this works, but basically if you have too much leakage, the climate isn't helped by fuel switching. But nobody knew how much methane was leaking. Simply didn't know. The guesses were a lot. This is just an example, the left bar of global emissions, the left is agriculture, the second one is oil and gas. So we set out to try and take the lessons that I had learned here at Hubbard Brook. How do I take a Hubbard Brook biogeochemical budget, only do it for the United States and for methane, and do it in 2 years? That was the challenge. And that's what we set out to do. So we sponsored 16 studies with 100 different collaborators, 50 corporations, 50 research institutions, more than 100 scientists, and we said to every one of the research groups, you can only do your science for 1 year. If it's going to take you 5 years, go to the National Science Foundation, we'll give you a letter of support. If you can do it in 1 year, we'll give you the money to go do the science. And the reason that got started is there was a panel, a Department of Energy subcommittee on fracking. Fred Krupp, the president of EDF, was on that panel, and John Deutsch, the former director of the CIA and currently at MIT on the faculty, chaired it. And that panel said that we didn't know enough about the methane emissions, and it would take $100 million of research to figure it out. And I told Fred, bullshit. I'd learned how to do systems work here. We could answer that question much faster and cheaper. We did a little homework. I said 10 million. It cost us 20. So we raised $12 million to give to the research community and use for our own staff who work on it. The partners, the corporate partners, contributed to the academic institutions, not to us. We don't collect corporate money. And then together, and the academic institutions contributed in kind of various sorts, including funding from together a little over $20 million. And this started 3 years ago, and now almost all the studies are released. Today, 12 of them appeared in a special issue of Environmental Science and Technology about the Barnett campaign that I'll talk about in a minute. But the idea was, could we take the biogeochemical approach here and apply it to a large system, industrial system, look at production, processing and transport, and the local distribution, using every possible technique we could think. So we didn't want it doing it one way. We wanted everybody to compete. So everybody could bring their different science and apply it and get access to industrial sites in a way that no one ever did. So we talked to the companies and said that having more data was going to help you. So you need to be part of this. And we found 50 companies who were willing to do that. Not all of them, but enough of them. And the research community, we challenged them, as I said, can they bring their science to bear on public policy? Since we started this study, using the results of this, in the first week that Ernie Moniz was Secretary of Energy, replacing Stephen Chu, I was sitting in his office talking about these studies. The EPA is now formulating regulations, and the President has announced a commitment based a lot, not exclusively, but a lot on this work of reducing methane emissions in the oil and gas industry by 44 to 45% by 2025, and the regulations will be released sometime this year to get that started. What is that relevant? We need to think about those same kinds of things here at Hubbard Brook. How do we bring in the partners? How do we think about the research in a non-traditional way so that we can get answers to the problems of what's the carbon implications of burning biomass, not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but in a year or a year or two at the maximum. I'm going to spend the remaining time talking about this Barnett Shale campaign, which was in many ways a Hubbard Brook only in microcosm. We decided to bring all the research teams to one place for 2 weeks in October 2013 and ask them to all take every biogeochemical approach they've got, which included airplanes, helicopters, drones, and do it all in the same region to see if we can understand methane emissions. And the papers released today were these, looking at it all kinds of ways in a series of articles from a whole dozens and dozens of researchers. The idea here is that you did on-site measurements, downwind sites driving, as well as in airplanes. How do you do it? People out in the field making measurements. It's not a forest. For those who are scientists, it's no different than the measurements I make out in the woods, right? Except you've got a piece of equipment and you're measuring it with a different equipment, but you've got the same kind of GCs and everything else in mobile labs, like this one from University of Houston, but there was one from Aerodyne from Massachusetts, a whole host of these, driving around the region, doing basic biogeochemistry. And then you see the different universities and private companies involved. Flying planes. One of the things that was never taught to me here at Hubbard Brook is how do you actually manage having multiple planes in the air at one time doing science? And I actually did at one point sort of panic when I realized I hadn't asked anyone's staff, was anyone coordinating all of this, which they were. The other thing you see on the left side, on the right side here, my left, is the model airplane that we mounted at Scientific Instruments in to actually do some of these measurements. A group out of Princeton working with the University of Houston did this work. Well, they finished the work, and only afterwards did I discover that the Texas state legislature, in its wisdom, passed a law the month prior that makes it a felony to make observations of private property without permission from the air using a drone. Another panic call to staff, did you get permission? Yes, we had permission. So I'm not locked up, but I came close, I think. So what did we create? We created maps that in many ways look no different than we would see, except they're 25 Texas counties, 300 kilometers by 300 kilometers. These are the maps here on the left of the density here of methane emissions throughout the region. And then over on the top, on the right here, is how much of it is thermogenic. How much of it comes from oil and gas? At the bottom, how much of it comes from biogenic sources, landfills, cattle, other sources. And separating it out, no one had ever done this before. Spatially explicit biogeochemistry. We do that here all the time. Peter's all the time figuring out where the hot spots for denitrification, which I know all of you really were hoping I was going to talk about, or he thought so. We do this all the time, taking exactly what we do here at Hubbard Brook, only doing it at a scale that's relevant to the questions that are important to setting good policy. It can be done. And then doing the source apportionment using the very latest techniques, the kinds of things we do here, is critical to the issue. Getting the planes, flying these large boxes, and doing it multiple times. I learned a lesson here. You don't measure it once in one place and call it good enough, even though Herb used to tell me that was the way to do it. I don't know, Gene, if he used to tell you that, but he told me that often, right? Take one sample and you don't have any contested results. Is to go back and do it multiple times. Nobody had ever taken those measurements from the air more than twice in the same region. This team did it 7 times, and we learned a lot about the variability and how it was going to happen. Again, this is all work that was done quickly using established techniques and bringing diversity of methodologies to the same area. And the results confirmed a meta-analysis by Brandt et al. That appeared in Science that said EPA's estimates of overall emissions were probably 50% too low, and a Miller et al., which was a paper using tower data, that estimated that methane emissions in the US was similarly 50% too low. The paper that appeared today, these were sort of a bit extrapolation. For the Barnett, what happens? The estimates by EPA are 50% too low. But we have the real data to show it now, and that the need for regulation is much greater than the industry would have said it needed, and it's real strong evidence in support of the regulations that will be proposed. And tying it to cost estimates. This is a curve that shows on the green side, it's usually referred to as a McKenzie curve. If you look here, these are the activities you can take that actually will net money to the industry. Now that we've identified where the leaks are, you can identify the actions people can take to fix them, and in turn, reduce the emissions, change the patterns. All of that done quickly in a targeted way to be effective in the ways that the early experiments at Hubbard Brook were. Unusual partnerships. We announced a year ago some work. I spent 2 years working on some methodology with Google to measure methane emissions under the streets of US cities quantitatively. Had not been done before. And just as a side story, any of you ever driven in a street view car? Probably not. I had the honor of doing that, or the privilege, or whatever. I should say, I don't know if it's either, because they're really small back seat and I don't have particularly good knees. So it was a bit stressful. And I did it one with an NPR reporter, and there was a story on NPR about it. And my sister afterwards called me up and said, the reporter really got it wrong. I said, why did the reporter get it wrong? I thought it was a pretty good story. She said, well, it describes you in the back seat, but forgets to say how big you are, because I was really folded up. But it's the closest I've ever come to feeling what it feels like, or getting a sense of what it feels like to be royalty. Why? You drive around in that car, everybody stares, does dances, and a few people does rude things that you can imagine. Wherever they come, they stop and they look. You feel like you have to go like this, right? Yeah. But what was amazing is Google, so we work with Google in a partnership. In this case, they pay for the car and the instruments. We do all the science on the back end. And what they did is we mounted a tube right here with a gas analyzer right in the back trunk. We had a set of these doing real-time biogeochemistry, driving the streets of American cities, analyzing them, in this case for methane. 9-second delay. So if you're driving it, you always have to look behind you as to what you just measured. But real time, you're seeing spikes in real time. And from that, by developing a set of algorithms with some work, working with Colorado State University researchers, we've mapped the cities of, this is Boston and Indianapolis. We've done Chicago, LA, Syracuse, for those of you from Syracuse. We've done Staten Island, and we're doing a series of other studies. And those are interactive. You can go on the website, you can pull in, you can pull out to any street, you can see where the leaks are, how big the leaks are, and compare it. So you can see Boston's really leaky compared to Indianapolis, because Boston has got 100-plus-year-old pipes, cast iron. Indianapolis has new plastic pipes because they replaced their pipes. The goal of this was to make it all so that what? The utilities start to think about this not just as a safety issue, which is critically important, but also an environmental issue, as does the PUCs, the Public Utility Commissions. By making these data transparent, it started to get a conversation going so that we now literally have utilities posting their data themselves. No one ever had this data before. It was never part of the public conversation. But we had to spend a lot of time making this data accessible. So there's a social psychologist I have on staff who did a lot of experiments to figure out how to present this data. I say readily and openly, every idea I had how to present this data was wrong. The way people react to the data, if they'd done it the way I thought it should be done, we would have had real problems. But instead, we took the same kinds of ideas of thinking the system and the reactions, only we did it with people and experiments and focus groups then, so we could create websites that didn't get fear, got concern and action. We wanted people to reach out to their public utility commissions, utilities, so we could get change and create an ability to reduce those leaks. And that's what's in fact happened. We also started a technology challenge, recognizing we didn't have the tools to do the monitoring to know when things leaked. So we worked together with companies and basically said we want equivalent of a carbon monoxide sensor for every well pad in America. So just like when the alarm goes off and here we leave and Ian figures out what went wrong, or he puts on his fireman's hat to come in and figure it out wearing that, not his Hubbard Brook hat, we need the same thing at every place where methane could be leaking, but it didn't exist. So we created, through a partnership, reaching out to companies to say, you need this, don't you? And we found a set of companies who said yes. And then we reached out to the technology companies and said, if you produce it, they'll buy it. They made a commitment. So where there was no appropriate technology, we actually have creating that technology. They're in second phase testing in the field, so that we demonstrate there's a market so we can bring the research equipment into practical application. The future of Hubbard Brook is wide open, but what will be the next experiment? How will we make what's going on at Hubbard Brook relevant to society in a way that really does change things? That's our challenge as a community. We've done it in the past. Gene, Herb, and the founders of Hubbard Brook showed us how to do it, but it's a different time. We have to do it differently, with different partnerships, asking different questions, but we can do it. My bet, and I'll just say it, I got the podium so I can say it, a few people have heard it, I think we should recut Watershed 5, but we'll decide what it is. That's my 2 cents, nothing more. The key is thinking forward, thinking differently, trying to create opportunities to be relevant in a changing world that needs the kind of insight that Hubbard Brook have is our challenge. I think we can do it, but we do need to be aggressive in thinking about it differently. Just like Pleasant View is still there, it's evolving. We now have Mirror Lake Hamlet. It's a much bigger, better facility that combined together allows us to do things to have numbers of people we never could have had before. We need to be bold to think about the future of research, thinking about how we can do it differently and how we can make a difference. Thanks very much.